but the big idea for, how many of you are entrepreneurs or want to be entrepreneurs? So in the 20th century, I'm going to tell you some old man history, and very quickly. In the 20th century, investors essentially treated startups as smaller versions of large companies. It's a big idea. There was no differentiation between what investors were telling startups to do than they would have told a large company to do. That is, they were telling you the way you succeeded is you wrote a 40-page business plan, with what the team, here's the opportunity, and more importantly, you had Appendix A, which was the forecast with a 5-year plan, which every number pointed to $100 million of revenue in year 5. In fact, I used to tell my students there was a secret Excel key code to auto-generate that, and some of them are still looking for those keys. The point is that people assumed that startups were not only smaller versions of companies, that all you had to do was execute the plan you just wrote. No one actually acknowledged that no business plan for a startup survived first contact with customers. That is, it was a document you wrote to get funded, you threw it in a drawer, and then you did something very different. And the insight that started the entire lean startup methodology and revolution was pretty simple. Large companies were executing known business models. They knew their customers, they knew their competitors, they knew pricing. They were large because they had discovered all this. But startups didn't know very much. Actually, startups were dealing with a series of unknowns. Startups were actually searching for business models. And this distinction between search and execution had never been articulated before. I mean, people kind of knew it, but people didn't quite say, wait a minute, the emperor has no clothes. You're making us do something that has no relevance here. And the reason why no one wanted to say that is we didn't actually know what it was you were supposed to be doing. And so my contribution was, one, having that insight, and then two, realizing that startups needed their own management stack. We had built 100 years of management tools for execution, but very little methodology for searching for business models. And the Lean Startup was just a summary of my work in customer discovery, Alexander Osterwalder's work in developing something called the Business Model Canvas, and Eric Ries's work in realizing that agile engineering was the way you could implement incrementally and iteratively. And some things fell out, things called minimum viable products and this notion of a pivot. And what it allowed us to do is have a kind of set of heuristics or a set of rules for startups on how to think about building companies. And to make a very long story short, it kind of swept the startup world in the beginning of the 21st century. And then your old magazine, the HBR, put it on the cover of 2013, which gave permission to large companies because it said on the cover of HBR, why the lean startup changes everything. And that happened to be the time that large companies were now dealing with continuous disruption. It's not like they weren't being disrupted and didn't know about it in the 20th century. Clayton Christensen and others and Rita McGrath here had been writing about it. But for the first time, they were dealing with disruption that was occurring continuously. And for the first time, large companies were looking to startups for methodologies. And so in the last 5 years, large corporations have been starting to adopt it. And the segue to our conversation is, gee, governments are waking up and thinking about crisis, or we no longer have 18 months between crises. We have about 18 minutes between crises. And so the methodologies we built in the 20th century to just deal with the Soviet Union and one main adversary, you need a scorecard of the day to figure out who we're dealing with. And so people are now starting to look to lean as the same potential set of methodologies for government. That's the end of the soliloquy.